Thank you so much to Joanne for starting us off this afternoon. I am delighted to be here moderating this panel about working together, about collaboration in conservation at a landscape scale. And as Joanne said, conservation at a landscape scale will only happen through collaboration, through partnership. I think we all know this to be true. In my role, I coordinate a partnership called Staying Connected. It's a cross-border collaboration spanning the eastern Canadian-U.S. border. This is an 80 million acre, or if you're in Canada, a 32 million hectare region called the Northern Appalachian and Acadian region. We've been working together since 2009 with a focus on sustaining forested landscape connections across this region. 2 countries, 5 states, 3 provinces, 2 different official languages, to keep the region healthy and resilient in the face of changing climate. And no single agency or organization can meet this challenge. We need to work together. So we bring together public agencies from 5 states, 3 provinces, the federal government, conservation organizations, land trusts, universities to work together. And we'll hear on this panel from 9 people who have been working in collaborative conservation at a landscape scale in all different environments and contexts. So this panel of experts, there are 9 of them here, will be sharing their experiences from urban environments to the Arctic, public, private. And it's a big panel, and we have an hour and a half. So each panelist will have a few minutes to set this up, a few. And so we're going to do this a little bit differently. We're going to start by going across the line, and each panelist will be will be sharing a case study, an example. It could be a national network. It could be in a specific place. And then we'll come back and go through and have a conversation after those case studies. Quick logistical note, I'm not sure there's going to be time for questions, but if there is, the red button, there's a button on the microphones for people down here that says speak. We're recording this entire conference, so we really want you to speak into the microphones, panelists included, so that we have good quality for audio. So you just press the speak button, you don't hold it down, it'll turn red when it's on, and you can turn it off in the same way. So wanted to mention that. So each panelist will be presenting herself or himself, will be introducing herself or himself before their case study so we can move through quickly. So we'll start with you, Wendy. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Jesse. Can we move the screen? Is that possible?
Yes.
Thanks. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Wendy Johnson. I'm with the National Park Service, and I'm the Superintendent of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our Appalachian Trail Landscape Partnership. That was established by the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, a unit of the National Park Service, and our cooperative management partner, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, or ATC, back in 2015. But it's really an initiative that began in 1921 with conservationist Benton Mackay and his project in regional planning. And when you only have 4 minutes to speak and 2 slides, what do? You put lots of stuff on your slide. So Benton Mackay's project, as he called it, has led to 250,000 acres of protected land along the Appalachian Trail in 14 states from Maine to Georgia. It's one of the most significant and successful land conservation programs in the United States. So our work is done then, right? Well, not quite. The AT Landscape Partnership builds upon a successful cooperative management system, but several things happen to bring large landscape conservation to the forefront for the AT. First, we had the call to action in the National Park Service, and that was a strategy to bring together staff and partners to advance a shared vision for our centennial in 2016 and into our 2nd century. And a key component of that was scaling up, an initiative to promote large landscape conservation to support healthy ecosystems and cultural resources. And I want to acknowledge Ray Savageau, one of our associate directors in the National Park Service, who leads the Scaling Up initiative. Also in 2015, ATC finalized a 5-year strategic plan, and one of its goals, proactive protection, included identifying and protecting high-priority landscapes within the AT corridor. Also in 2015, the National Park Service finished our foundation document and our business plan, which specifically identified the landscape as a fundamental resource and value for the AT. And you can see all those different documents on the screen. So we made a conscious decision with virtually all of the footpath on public and protected land to turn our attention to the larger landscape. So the National Park Service and ATC decided to be co-conveners for this initiative, and ATC established a new position, a Director of Landscape Conservation, with my great partner Dennis Schaefer being hired in May 2015, and he leads this initiative for us, and he's here today. So when we convened our first partner meeting in early December 2015, we had nearly 70 participants, and many of them are here with us today. We sought to develop a shared vision recognizing the collective action needed to preserve the AT in perpetuity. And we asked ourselves, what might a protected landscape look like in 2050? A primary goal of the first workshop was to establish the foundation for partnership building, initiate the process to identify high-priority target areas, discuss communication strategies to engage all partners, and consider funding sources. We wanted to reach out to new partners who had not been a part of the AT cooperative management system in the past. So we had a mapping exercise, and you can see that's one of the photos on the screen. And we looked at where we had literally a map of the AT across a whole room in one of the rooms here at NCTC. And during that first meeting, we also spent time seeking guidance from participants on the direction that the initiative should take, what resources were available to the group, different models for community engagement, and we learned how other large landscape initiatives functioned. And one of the outcomes was the meeting that we established a steering committee and an annual meeting. So during our next meeting in 2016, we rolled up our sleeves and began to craft a vision and mission statement. And after revisiting the 30 priority areas that we originally identified during that mapping exercise, we narrowed the list to 10 after map reviews and ranking exercises based upon known value, where there is a threat based upon our priorities and also the set of partners that we had in place. And I'm told to stop, so I'm going to move that forward to my next colleague.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm Steve Jester, Executive Director of Partners for Conservation, a national landowner-led organization that works not on projects, but on people and relationships. So my case study is going to be just a little bit different than everybody else's, I think. What I'm going to talk about are what we have discovered in successful landscape-level collaborations that are going on all around the country with the policies we have now, the funding we have now, the science we have now, and the processes we have now, and what they share as opposed to what is different about them. And I'm going to be taking the photos and maybe a few comments specifically from an example in western Montana and an example in northern California, but it's mostly going to be about the people. These kind of work in a stepwise fashion. Like I said, if you peel away all the layers of the onion, this is where you get down to what's the same. And I think it's most effective and sustainable when this happens on the front end of your planning process or your collaboration, as opposed to being an afterthought and trying to sell it to your community of interest. Effective communication and relationships. This is Dina Moore and Mark Moore from Northern California. Actually started with neighbors, Dean Hunt, who's in the room with us, and many others, a collaboration addressing water quality in Northern California. The first step in theirs and all other collaborations is building that trust and credibility. It goes down through, in cases where it works, it's goes down, passed down through the generations. These are Loren and Aura. It's Mark and Dina's daughter and granddaughter. Loren is an executive director for the Buckeye Conservancy, also working on landowner, public-private, landowner-led collaboration. So it's trust and credibility are things that are critically important to moving forward. The 80-20 rule was already mentioned. I'd like to mention that Cole Mannix is in the room. His father, David, is credited, for all I've heard, with coming up with this concept. But the shared vision in these landscapes is usually there. It's just a matter of discovering it, and that's where the 80-20 rule comes from. Usually if you gather the stakeholders up and they talk about what's important in a landscape, they'll share about 80% of that vision. So it's not something that you have to create. It's something that you have to bring out and work from that. Everybody comes to a partnership for a different reason. If your definition of a partnership is, how do I get you to help me do my job, that's a transactional relationship. That's not a partnership. That shared vision, you can come from different perspectives, but as long as the vision is shared, it's something that becomes actionable. This is another young man, Brady Stone, and the ranch dog Dylan, second generation or third generation really of starting to work collaboratively. But the thing that all these things that work share are a focus on the triple bottom line, and that's what makes it sustainable. You have to look at not just the ecological impacts or ecological aspects of your landscape, but you also have to look at the things that are important for the people that live and work there. The economics, the community, legacy, all those intangibles that we don't like to talk about and we're not trained on. But they are skills that are accessible to anyone. You just have to be engaged in the process of developing yourself to bring them out and make them part of what you do. I think I'm done. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Chanelle Smith, and I'm the newly minted Ohio State Director for the Trust for Public Land. I have been in my role since June, and I have to tell you that one of my most exciting days was hearing about black bear sighting on one of the 400-acre properties that we just conserved, and later in that day being in the basement of a public housing authority facility with kids talking about how they want access to Lake Erie and how our towpath and our trail that we've helped create is going to get them to Lake Erie. And so I think everyone is familiar with the mission of the Trust for Public Land, and that's land for people. And one of the two projects that we've really worked on most recently in Ohio is the Cleveland Foundation Centennial Trail. The trail actually connects 24,000 people to Lake Erie from southern Ohio, where the Cuyahoga Valley National Park is, up into Cleveland. But there was this one missing link. There was 1.3 miles missing that would actually get people to Lake Erie. So the Trust for Public Land worked with the local metro parks. We worked with the local CDCs. We engaged communities within that 1.3 miles. And just this summer, the second phase of this trail was completed. In the spring of 2018, the final Wendy Park Bridge will be built. That's going to connect those 24,000 people to the lake. So the other part of this is really the human aspect part. The Trust for Public Land, we're really good at acquiring land. We're really good at landscape conservation. But the other thing that I don't think is always told is our human engagement. I feel like everything that we do at the Trust for Public Land includes participatory design and engaging people. We build parks with people, not just for people, but we engage them in the process. And so this is just a map of the Cuyahoga River, and hopefully all you guys can come to Cleveland in 2019 to help celebrate the cleaning of the Cuyahoga and the emergence of the EPA. But this is just a picture of the location in Lakeview Terrace, the park that we're working on right now. So Lakeview Terrace is actually the first publicly owned public housing facility in the country. In 1937, Eleanor Roosevelt came to Cleveland to open up this facility, and it was imagined as a green space. But over the decades, it's lost that luster, and it's right now it's surrounded by a stone company, so you can see all the dust, and it's really an air pollution hazard for the people, for the 2,300 low-income households that live there. And so we've been engaging in the community, talking to the kids, their parents, and their grandparents about what do they want a park to look like. And one of the little girls, she actually designed a waterfall coming down a tree, and we had to let her know, well, you know, we can make things happen, but I don't know if we can make that particular thing happen. And so this project will be about $2 million project that we're working on, but the best part of this, I have to tell you, is talking to those residents and listening to people talking about just getting to the lake. They just want to fish. They want to walk. They want to be able to breathe clean air. And at the Trust for Public Land, through participatory design and working in community and with community, we're hopeful that we can make this happen for them.
Hi, I'm Joel Dunn. I'm the president and CEO of the Chesapeake Conservancy. I'm thrilled to be with you today. You guys, I know probably a lot about the Chesapeake. It stretches from Cooperstown to Virginia Beach, from the Appalachian mountaintops to the home of the blue crab, 180,000 miles of streams and great rivers that feed our bay. And that huge landscape requires epic collaboration and innovative technology to achieve our conservation objectives on a scale that's commensurate with the challenge and the ecosystem. Many of you are familiar with our challenges. We've got fragmentation and development and pollution and climate change issues and dangerously poor water quality. And I don't want to belabor all those threats. What I want to talk about is how our community has been committed to restoring and protecting the Chesapeake for decades. In fact, 1983 was the first multi-state agreement. But only recently, in the last 6 or 7 years, have we expanded into beyond the water column to think about land conservation and how that really contributes to the bay restoration goal. And so our community formed the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership in 2009 to really focus in on the value of land conservation to the bay restoration movement. And we were very fortunate to get John Griffin, the former Secretary of Natural Resources in Maryland, to coordinate our partnership. Many of our steering committee members are here today. Brenda Barrett, who you heard from earlier, Chris Miller, Jonathan Doherty, Jennifer Herzog. Lots of our members are here in the crowd too, including Kristen Thomas-Gard-Spence from DOD's REPI program. So you guys are really familiar with us. We helped coordinate this conference a few years ago, as Bob mentioned earlier. The purpose of my contribution to this panel, though, was to focus on how our Chesapeake Conservation Partnership had established some strategies and leveraged technology to get there. We're wrestling with a big, hairy, audacious goal of trying to maybe protect 50% of the watershed by 2050, inspired by E.O. Wilson. We're maintaining and defending public funding sources for conservation, whether it's the Land and Water Conservation Fund or state funding. We're harnessing mitigation and ecosystem markets. Our partners at the Environmental Law Institute are doing an analysis for us across all 6 states in the District of Columbia of how we can leverage that. We're crediting land conservation in the total maximum daily load model for the Chesapeake, which will add a lot to conservation. And we're leveraging the outdoor recreation economy to create parks and trails and access. But one of the things we're doing is we're trying to democratize conservation by developing new data and distributing it to all of our partners. See, conservation is local, and so we're trying to empower all of our partners, individual landowners, mom and pop land trusts, with the most powerful, best data that's available to fuel all of those goals I just rode through. This is the old data for Washington, D.C. That's the National Land Cover Data Set, which comes out every 5 to 7 years. It's 30-meter resolution. And you may be familiar, National Harbor was built within the last 3 years. So there's now a city that didn't appear on the National Land Cover Data Set as currently viewed. But what we did was we produced high-resolution land cover data for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed and distributed it as open data to our entire community. I know Claire Billett and other partners on the Delaware have leveraged this resolution data for their landscapes. Well, I want to end by saying that we're now partnering with Microsoft and Esri to do this and potentially for the entire country. And rather than taking months to produce the data, we're talking about days. And we're talking about producing it on a regular basis to provide the fuel for our conservation community, the evidence we need to fuel new conservation initiatives and defend existing ones. Thanks.
Well, my name is Loren, BirdRattler, and I work for the Blackfeet tribe. I work in the agriculture policy development field. And so I appreciate the folks that organized the conference here for inviting us and allowing us to be a part of everything that you're doing. And so I just wanted to touch a little bit on traditional ecological knowledge and how we utilize holistic management planning at the Blackfeet tribe to inform our policy development. And so here I'm going to go back to this. This is actually a prairie pothole wetland with our E&E, or buffalo. That's how you say buffalo in the Blackfeet language there on the reservation. I wanted to utilize this photo mostly to get you to come and visit us. I think that when we talk about partnerships, it's integral that we look at partnering with tribes in the future to really augment conservation practices and see what they bring to the table that certainly would be aligned with a lot of your efforts. And so when we talk about traditional ecological knowledge, what do we really mean by that? Well, for us at Blackfeet, it's identifying our core values and utilizing those core values to inform all facets of policy development. And so when we think about those core values, it's a real respect for all living things, that everything does have a voice, and so and they need to be at the policy development table along with you. When they are, you tend to be much more inclusive of them when it comes to policy development. And so one of the examples in that, and I'll cover it a little bit more later, is the E&E initiative, or the Buffalo Reintroduction Initiative. When we were having all of our pre-meetings on buffalo reintroduction, we had an empty chair at the table for the buffalo to signify and to remind us that that we need to speak for them as well. And so I think that when we think about how we utilize those core values to develop policy, it's necessary that we do so across the spectrum. The second part of that is the holistic management and what that really means. We tend to utilize Western science to identify these small little pieces or microcosms in our work. And as a result, we get mired in those small little pieces and we forget about the whole. So when you think about holistic management planning, and what we try to do is certainly think about the entire system, the entire process. And I think that Joanne had covered that in her presentation as well. And so without recognizing that larger system, we tend to think that we're at the top and can dictate or control all of the natural process within that system. And so what we try to do is observe natural process and then incorporate that into our management practices. And so it's a little bit of a different approach, some similarities, certainly some differences when you think about modern conservation approaches. And so how are we using traditional ecological knowledge to augment our conservation practices? Well, first, for me, we have to absolutely make the correlation to agriculture and agriculture policy. So that means that not only are we utilizing our core values to inform that policy development, but that we're making correlations to sustainable economic development. I think that when we think about tribes and the lack of capacity that exists in Indian country, we oftentimes forget about that. And so it's very easy to be idealistic without recognizing that these large intact ecosystems are really balanced on the backs of high unemployment rates on reservations. So we always have to be cognizant of that. So how do we make correlations to sustainable economic development, to the narrowing of health disparities among our people, and how do we infuse that institutional knowledge into our youth? And so I think that all of those are integral pieces that we have to consider when we're doing policy development. So some of the real on-the-ground initiatives that we've done, and I don't have one case study, unfortunately I have a couple, and I could really talk about 10, but one of them is, of course, the E&E initiative and the reintroduction of buffalo into the natural landscape. We've partnered with the National Park Service, Glacier National Park, with Wathen National Park, the Blood Timber Reserve, the National Forest Service, as well as the Blackfeet tribe to look at intact areas that we could do reintroduction. So that's created a lot of collaboration amongst those governments. And so when you think about the ability to herd cats, you're really talking about herding wildcats in wide open spaces. And so we've been successful in doing that. And so we're this close to actually doing a reintroduction where we're starting in Badger 2 Medicine, then moving up to the Chief Mountain, and then joining those pieces in the middle. The other piece is we've recently been funded to do a beaver mimicry project and how we look at the beaver and its contribution to policy development. In our case, the beaver was the animal that brought the practice of who we are as Blackfeet people to the Blackfeet. And so as we utilize and look at storytelling and other native lifeways and how we utilize that to augment conservation practices, we're really making the correlations between those animals, our storytelling, and how we use them to augment modern day conservation. And so those are just a couple quick ideas. I just wanted to cover opportunities. I think that when you think about partnerships, when you look around, when you look around this room, I think that half of the people of color are sitting on this panel, and so are we really doing an effective job in creating partnerships and diversifying our efforts? And so when you think about partnerships with Indian country or tribal governments, the opportunity is wide open. We are quasi-sovereign nations, and so the opportunity to do pilot projects on reservations and then duplicate them in non-native areas is very ripe, and so we invite you to have those conversations with us. With that, thank you very much.
So I'm Mike Zupko, and alphabetically I thought I was going last. So I was gonna spill over into the questions. No, I represent a group called the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, which is a federal, state, local, and tribal construct that works at the strategic level. And as such, I'm going to start kind of from a large view and then drill down pretty quick. I think we've heard on several different panels, several different conversations this morning about wildfires. We know they're destructive. We know they're dangerous. Nearly 9 million acres burned this year already. Preparedness level 5, 28,000 firefighters out on the line, completely tapped out resources nationally, lives lost, unfortunately, and thousands of homes lost as well. So we know this is an issue, it's been an issue, and it's not one that's easily solved. But in looking at that, back in 2009, Congress challenged that group with the development of a cohesive strategy, and the top right, or the bottom right there has the 3 elements of that I'm going to talk a little bit about. They're inextricably linked, and when you do or don't do work in one area, it impacts the other area. So to look at kind of a national network, the Fire Adapted Communities Network, Learning Network, is a national level construct that is a place where those best practices can be shared. It works off of a hub and spoke model. You can see I think it's 17 different hubs, groups across the country. They all operate very differently. They learn from one another, and they're also challenged with reaching out further than just their local area. There's a lot of challenges that come with that, and I'm going to drop into 2 examples that actually reach across all 3 of those elements that you saw on the first slide. So this is the city of Ashland, Oregon, southern Oregon, right close to the California border. They're surrounded by national forest land primarily. They love their forests. They historically have been a hands-off a community that kind of believed in hands-off management. Let's not do anything, don't touch the landscape. And they love their water. Their watershed's been impacted by fires through the years, as well as some other forest health challenges. So about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit less, these 4 groups primarily came together to put together a Ashland Forest Resiliency Stewardship Project built out of their Community Wildfire Protection Plan in 2004. And through those discussions, they realized that there was multiple management techniques that they could work on together. They started talking about harvesting timber. That's something that community had not been in favor of in the past. They actually have had conversations even about diameter, size, and pushing the limit there. They've become big proponents of prescribed fire. They can't do a lot of it there right now due to some of the way the state looks at the air regulations, but they're really pushing the limits on prescribed fire. They start talking about good smoke versus bad smoke. Choose your smoke. So some pretty innovative things through that group have really come together through the past 5 or 7 years. To look at kind of the extreme opposite side of the country where I'm from, this is a little town of Taylor, Florida. I'm actually from Georgia, but it's right on the state line. The town of Taylor, Florida this is a wildfire risk map, has a challenge. They're surrounded by, or to the north of them is the Okefenokee Swamp. They're surrounded by state, private, and local land that's managed heavily, industrial timberland, or the previous industrial timberland. It's managed as an investment. And they have wildfires. They have big wildfires, and they have them every 3 to 5 years. Wildfires swept through that town on 3 different occasions in the past 10 years. And so they've worked closely both with that network, but also with a group called the Greater Okefenokee Association of Landowners to really address the response risk here. This group of landowners, when you talk about, I think Jimmy Bullock said it earlier, you have landowners down there, you talk to one guy, he's got 100,000 acres. You talk to another guy, he's got 150. So you can get 20 landowners in a room and talk about 2 or 3 million acres when you throw in the national forest and when you throw in the refuge. So this group down here has really looked at what can they do on the response side of things. That map that just popped up is a thing called a swamp edge break, where the landowners voluntarily decided to push down timber to where they could have a large fire break to start from. That's one of the landowners that owns about 100,000 acres. They also built dip sites on their property. They carve out about a half acre, just a hole in the ground. The water table's so high down there typically where the helicopters could get in and pull water out. So they've worked really closely together from the federal, state, and local or private level to work these issues forward. And it's been a pretty amazing thing over the past 15, 20 years that group's been together. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Kunen with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about large landscape conservation in a climate change context. And so WCS comes at that topic both as an implementer on the ground, but also as the largest funder of applied conservation adaptation activities in the United States. So through, for folks who don't know, through the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund, we've awarded over $12 million of funding to over 60 applied adaptation projects around the country for wildlife conservation with climate adaptation interventions. So if you don't know us, check us out and apply. So one of the principles of the work that we undertake is that we encourage practitioners of climate adaptation work to take this larger landscape perspective on conservation. We think that that's needed for a couple of really, really key reasons. First is that it's really essential to take a large landscape lens approach to identify refugia, where species can find suitable conditions in the future. And if we just look at sort of small areas, we're possibly going to miss those future options. And secondly, to accommodate the increasing dynamism and uncertainty of conditions. So basically, it's a risk management strategy. And thirdly, of course, to foster cross-jurisdictional coordination on solutions, because some solutions for wildlife are just going to inherently require increasing connectivity, and that connectivity is inherently going to cross different jurisdictions. So ultimately, we're basically saying that we think these large intact landscapes are going to be critical to the success of wildlife as they adapt. And what we're finding from our work and the work of our grantees is that actually many species are quite adaptable if you give them space and time to adjust, and you enable them, basically the enabling conditions for wildlife to cope. So the specific case study just from our work that I'm just going to mention that kind of illustrates these points is from the Arctic, where we've been working across Canada, the United States, and Russia in the part of the Arctic that's Beringia, so over on the western side. And the reason why I'm focusing on this, of course, the Arctic is one place where we have to think about large landscape conservation because conditions are rapidly changing and becoming much more uncertain. So in the case of walrus, what's happening is basically they're losing sea ice on which to haul out. So their haul out patterns are just totally new. They're coming out on land. They're coming out in particular right near a lot of native Alaskan villages. And so the place where those the haul outs are taking place is sort of variable over the years, so it's sort of unpredictable. So a couple different things need to happen, and the threat, of course, to walruses is if you disturb them, they stampede into the water, and then you get a large mortality. We'd like to. So 3 key points here in the case study. One is international cooperation on this issue. So in this particular case, Russia has been monitoring their walrus populations for a lot longer than we have. So we're learning a lot of lessons from them, and that kind of sharing is essential. I think a second point is monitoring, the importance of science and monitoring so that we can develop some predictive patterns so that we know potentially, and we can plan ahead for where the haul-outs might happen. And then really key third point is local stewardship. So basically the native Alaskan villages themselves are taking responsibility for protecting the walrus aggregations, protecting their own residents from any conflict, and doing things like keeping journalists who might be overly curious away, keeping local dogs away, and really just kind of taking ownership of this response. But that community engagement requires support. So those are sort of the basic interventions that we've been taking. Here's just some beautiful photos of it. And I'll stop there. Yeah, I think it's starting to die.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. My name's Greg Wathen. I'm the coordinator for the Gulf. Is not on. It's on now. Can y'all hear? Yes. Okay. Technical. There we go. I can hear myself now. Okay, my name is Greg Wathen. I'm the coordinator for the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And I'm going to talk to you about Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy this afternoon, but I want to start out with a slide about the LCCs, just kind of give you the context perspective of that. So this is kind of the map of the LCC network. Many of you all, I'm sure, have seen this before. There's 22 LCCs. They were established back in 2009. Covers huge territories in North America, the Pacific Ocean, Caribbean. In fact, our LCC network, when we want to talk with each other across the entire network, we figured out early on that 2 p.m. Eastern time was the time when we could get everybody from the Hawaii to the East Coast to do that. So it's pretty broad and wide. And one of the things we quickly realized within the LCC network is that there are huge differences across this entire network, culturally, regionally, and things like that. And so we had to start thinking about ourselves from that regional perspective and start to approach some of our conservation objectives from a regional perspective, although we have a national network. So the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides here. This is a map of the blueprint that we came out with last year. Blueprint sort of highlights the priority landscapes across the Southeast. Took us 5 years to get to this point. It represents the efforts of 6 LCCs in the Southeast and kind of compiles and assimilates all of their conservation priorities. If you open up the hood and look under that map there, those blue areas, you would see 6 different ways of approaching landscape conservation, so it's important to understand that. But it does come as sort of our first effort for really identifying what the priorities are across the Southeast in terms of a conservation perspective. If you overlay the urban landscape on top of that, this is 2020 and what it looks like, all of a sudden you realize there's some challenges with us achieving that blueprint, so to speak. And then if you look into the future a little bit further, 2060, you really realize what those challenges are for our LCC cooperatives. This is what we're dealing with. This is what we're looking at into the future. And it does not include anything like climate change or sea level rise or other issues that are just as important and just as really going to impact and shape the landscape. So we're trying to get ahead of the curve, think about what kinds of strategies we can develop today, the next 10 years, that will help us to kind of get in front of that curve. That urban landscape that's coming at us is really going to shape the future conservation landscape in the Southeast. As we've been going through this effort to do this, we've kind of developed some what we call collaborative conservation models there. This was sort of a first iteration of that. At the top, you have some sponsoring agencies like the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies over the states, the state fish and wildlife agencies. You also have a group called SNRLIG. We call it SNRLIG. That's a Southeast Natural Resources Leadership Group. That's the federal agencies that are involved in the Southeast. You have all the LCCs. And then to your right, you have a bunch of other landscape scale partnerships that are involved in the Southeast, such as joint ventures and fish habitat partnerships and so forth. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of people involved in making decisions about that. We've evolved a little bit to where we hired a coordinator and brought that in and thought a little bit more about this organizational structure and how can it work better. So that was the latest evolution. And then the big question is with LCCs sort of being on the chopping block for funding, what happens to the LCCs and what happens to our organizational structure as we move forward. And the LCCs brought 2 functions in my mind that really were important to this collaborative conservation. One of those being a very strong science foundation. They They created that map that you saw early on of the blueprint, and that was based on the science for those 6 LCCs. They also provided forums for the collaboration, bringing partners together to talk about and develop a shared vision, things like that. So if LCCs go away, we have to replace both of those elements, both of those functions, both the science foundation and some kind of collaborative formation there. I'm done. Thank you, Sean.
Hi, I'm Chris Miller. I'm president of the Piedmont Environmental Council. We were started in 1972 by landowners and community leaders to plan for a sustainable future. So we're a little weird in that we were ahead of the curve on integrated whole communities planning. In 1988, we set a goal of protecting 50% of the private land area. And so E.O. Wilson is a wonderful collaborator. I'm glad he caught up. And all through the process, we've relied on a whole series of partnerships. I once did a flow chart of all of our relationships. It was like 3,500 partners, not including individual landowners. My board asked me to hide that slide because it's terrifying when you think about it. We're a multi-generational approach. We often talk about multi-generations. We had an event Saturday night with 3 generations represented in our fundraising effort, so that sort of signifies that. Sort of scale picture, this is the area just to the west of Washington, D.C., between the Potomac River and the James River. We include the fastest growing metropolitan county in the country, Loudoun County, and another county, Loudon, which is actually losing population. So the whole spectrum of planning issues and a whole array of different types of geologies and landscapes. Over that time, 1972 to the present, we've helped protect 400,000 acres of private land and about 125,000 acres of public land. And the process of filling that in is the partnership with communities and landowners over time. We started with public lands, and I learned this sort of relatively late in my career. But the first major additions to the landscape of conservation were wildlife management areas using the duck stamp funds from the 1930s. And then after that, everything was private, conservation easements, so that by 2015, in this particular part of the world, you had this interlocking web of conservation easements, rural historic districts, scenic byways, national heritage areas, just a whole lot of variations on the theme of interrelated conservation layers. Joining the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership has sort of highlighted the effectiveness of that. When we mapped heritage against some of the wildlife values, we found that the heritage values were better planned and better articulated. It kind of freaked out the scientists. They backed off and said, well, there must be something wrong with the weighting here, because how could that possibly be? One of the things I would draw attention to is the view. Most of the public enjoys outdoors and large landscapes visually. And so don't underestimate view sheds. They can be incorporated into planning for parks, and it can be incorporated in planning for historic districts. It's the way 85% of 100% of the world enjoys nature. 85% of visitors to national parks will tell you that they enjoy the trip there as much as they enjoy the park. So don't underestimate those view sheds. They can be a great planning tool. There's lots of tools out there. This is a matrix we did for the Virginia Secretary of Natural Resources to show her the adopted public policies at the federal, state, and local level that we utilize in conservation within our region. Everything from local comprehensive planning that incorporate cultural and biological and working landscape goals, all the way up to national policies that we're helping to implement. And when we did a recent inventory of what was left to protect towards that 50% goal, this was just some of the layers that reflect some of those cultural values. For us, Civil War battlefields, the pink areas are unprotected as yet. These are existing rural historic districts, which actually directly correspond with watersheds and riparian, important riparian habitat, scenic byways. That total area is in the hundreds of thousands of acres that still need to be protected. And so it provides an existing policy basis for getting to a 1 million acre goal, which is the 50% that E.O. Wilson finally understood.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to move into a bit of a discussion. I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions, and if we have some time, we'll take some questions from you, all of you, and observations as well. So I'm not going to attempt to sum up some of the challenges and successes here. I'm going to instead turn it over to the panelists. Tell us what you learned. What did you learn in this case from the case study you presented here? What are some of the big challenges of working through collaborative partnerships for landscape conservation? What are some of the successes? Greg?
Yeah, thanks. So some of the lessons I think that we've learned through the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy was the importance of having some strong leadership. We had a state director, in Tennessee, Ed Carter, who was really kind of a cheerleader for us with the Fish and Wildlife agencies. And then on the federal side, we had Cindy Donor, who's the regional director for the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Southeast, who was really important in terms of really providing key leadership and keeping CCAS, we call it CCAS or CCAS, sort of front and center in front of these people and keeping it alive and moving, things like that. There wasn't buy-in early on by the directors of the Fish and Wildlife agencies, and it took, because the LCCs were brand new, it just took a while for them to start to really visualize what it could look like. Last year, when we finally unveiled the first blueprint, showed them the map, the excitement started to really grow as you started to get this buy-in from both the state fish and wildlife agencies and the federal agencies involved and kind of seeing the potential, things like that. So leadership was really important there. We also learned that we needed a coordinator. We had 6 LCCs. Each LCC was kind of doing their own thing, approaching conservation the way their partnership wanted them to do it, but when you tried to put them across, kind of match them up, they didn't always match up very well. So having a coordinator who could sort of address things, look at that bigger picture and help to coordinate across LCC lines, things like that, I think was really instrumental there. The last lesson I'm going to mention is the one that I wrote down after Joanne talked, and I think it's probably pretty relevant here, is reinvent yourself continuously and change your culture for results. And I think with the status of LCCs, the funding situations, things like that, we're going to have to probably reinvent ourselves based on the current status of where we are budget-wise, things like that. The need for this, the need for visioning what a future conservation landscape is going to look like, it's not gone away. It's still important. Landscape conservation is still important, but how we get there is going to change and that kind of thing. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Very good.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm next. Yeah, great. So I was asked to just kind of think of a couple of pithy lessons learned from our experience, and I'll point to 3. I think one is the importance of locally appropriate solutions to your issues. We spend a lot of time in the Arctic case, but this is true across the portfolio of work we do. Finding common ground with local stakeholders, and then trying to address needs of capacity, incentives to participation, whether it's training or knowledge or whatever, so that local stakeholders can be really active proponents and solutions. So in the case of the walrus, of course, this requires native villages to actually, actively monitor the haul-outs, actively kind of protect their communities from the animals, and actively work, of course, to protect the animals, which are themselves culturally extremely important species. So that's locally appropriate solutions being embedded in the context, I think, is lesson number 1. I think the second thing is definitely engaging in future scenario planning and just understanding that when you talk about large landscape conservation and you're talking about collaboration, you're necessarily talking about lots of different stakeholders, and you're probably each imagining a different future in that landscape, but you somehow have to come together in some kind of participatory process and at least arrive at some, shared set of possible future scenarios that represent, some inputs and some wins for all of your different stakeholders. And that requires investment. Like, that requires cash, right? Like, we need to fund that. We need to fund people's time. We need to fund to get over the opportunity cost of people doing that. But futures scenario planning is an absolutely essential key, and investing in monitoring to see how you're doing against that scenario, I think, is critical. And then the third thing, as everyone in this conference has said, is the importance of trust and relationships that do not get constructed instantaneously. Relationships amongst people, it can take years. The case that I mentioned, of course, involved an international collaboration between the United States and Russia, so you can imagine how long it takes to build that kind of trust. But in any context, it's just, you have to just invest and be prepared to invest the time to build those relationships, because you're going to need everybody to be part of that solution. It sounds like a platitude, but I think everyone would probably agree with that.
Thanks. Wendy, we'll turn it to you.
Thank you. Is that on? Okay, great. Well, we just had our third annual meeting last month here at NCTC, and one lesson that we've learned is the shift in focus to large landscape conservation also requires a shift in thinking about the scope of resource values and the depth of community engagement. So to have a fully integrated program, I know this has been mentioned before, you're examining natural, cultural, scenic, recreational, and economic resources. And when you invite people to participate, another lesson learned is that you have to keep them engaged, continue to build momentum, and show results. As an initiative matures and develops, you have to turn that initial enthusiasm into concrete and tangible results. And diversity was also mentioned. That's something that we're always asking. Who's not at the table with us? Because that diversity ensures success in viewpoints, approaches, communities, and organizations. We're striving with our AT Landscape Partnership for a Big Ten approach to have new partners and be inclusive. But another lesson learned is when you're trying to be strategic, such as when we're choosing our priority and focal areas going from 30 to 10, when someone does not see their priority area on a map or a list, then they feel left out. So it's always working to be as inclusive as possible. And another lesson learned is many regional and local landscape programs overlap with each other. So the AT Landscape Partnership is well positioned to promote and advance these collaborative efforts. But the flip side is that numerous sub-AT landscape initiatives employ different frameworks for governance, collaboration, and communication. So integration is not always easy, and you're always having to strive to make sure that you're working from multiple values framework and also towards multifaceted goals. And I think once again, as it's been mentioned, this can be hard work, it takes time, and can be challenging, but it's so incredibly rewarding, and it's well worth it.
So some of the challenges that we have in terms of doing work in Indian country is certainly understanding the jurisdictional complexities that exist in Indian country. And so I also sit on a steering committee of governments that our primary purpose is to address noxious weeds or invasive species, both aquatic and terrestrial. And so when we first had our initial meeting, we had to bring all of the stakeholders to the table. And by stakeholders, in this case, I'm talking about governments. And so we had the United States government, and under the United States government, under Interior, we had the National Park Service, since we border Glacier National Park on the west. We had the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Under BIA, we had irrigation, roads, and range. Under Interior, we also had the Bureau of Reclamation and the Bureau of Land Management. All of those have a stake in Blackfeet country. When we think about USDA, there was NRCS, APHIS, National Forest Service, among others. The state of Montana, the State Highway Department, the county governments, Glacier County, Pend Oreille County, weed districts, the roads departments. And so when you think about those jurisdictional complexities in Indian country, it's challenging to get all of those governments to the table and actually work together. And so, so that's one of the challenges that we had. But we did bring them to the table, and we are working together, and we are leveraging resources. And so the next is an omission of a native school of thought in the scientific process. That prohibits many of the work that should be going on in Indian country because it doesn't recognize the contributions of traditional ecological knowledge in management or other areas. The third is the lack of data and resources in Indian country. When we think about the ability to substantiate our need and to actually access funding, that's one of the larger challenges that we have because a lot of that data just doesn't exist. When you think about census data, it's based on counties, not on reservations. There's just a whole slew of challenges that come with the lack of data or accessing that data. Because of those jurisdictional complexities and the privacy behind their data, it's very difficult to access anything in Indian country to substantiate your need. The next is the willingness to partner with tribes. I think that when you look at across the landscape, that in itself becomes very challenging because of some of the aforementioned things that I had just covered. And then I just have two more real quick. And so the other is match requirements for funding. When we think about match requirements for tribal governments are mired in social services and dealing with social services and underwriting social services. And so as a result, when you get match requirements, then conservation efforts tend to get put on the back burner. And so we need to reverse that and put them on the front burner because when you think about sustainable economy, sustainable anything, we're not accomplishing that primarily because of that issue. And then the last is planning from a holistic place. The conservation community tends to be very similar to tribal governments, and that's that we're very reactionary. We're reactionary in nature, and as a result, we spend our time putting out all these small fires rather than doing the comprehensive planning. So we recognize a need, we go after the money for that need, we end up utilizing the funders' parameters to become our program parameters, and we never actually do the comprehensive planning. And so what we want to do is turn that on its head and actually do the comprehensive planning up front and have funding to do so, and then make the correlations to those funding priorities that fit within the parameters for our needs and not backwards. When you think about some of those opportunities, the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana has 55% of Montana's biodiversity. If you think about a regular size map, you take 2 fingers, 55% of that biodiversity is in those 2 fingers on that large map. And so we have some great opportunities to be proactive, to develop policies that allow us to protect that intact ecosystem without being reactionary. And so those are some of the lessons that we learned and certainly some of the challenges that accompanied those lessons.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So my next question is about looking to the future, looking ahead. What are some recommendations you have to facilitate the work of collaborative partnerships, working at a landscape scale, to achieve broader, better success? And recommendations within landscapes, and then also recommendations for this broader community of practice. Chris, you want to start?
There we go. So a couple of thoughts. One is to constantly be evaluating the communities that you work with. We try to do polling every 3 to 4 years, usually ahead of election cycles. It's a useful knowledge to have before you get a new governor, a new set of General Assembly members, even local officials, so that you can be, at least as a snapshot, well aware of what those community values are. It's great to have working partnerships with individual people, but sometimes a broader set of scientific polling can be helpful. We polled in 2016 in Virginia in our 9 counties. We oversampled for every county, and we found that 65% of the people who lived there were self-identified conservatives. 70% voted for Donald Trump the next year. That's a tough constituency in some respects to do conservation. But that same set of demographics, 75% felt that quality of life was their #1 concern. Not taxes, not immigration, not jobs, but quality of life. And they defined that in ways we could work with: protection of public drinking water, food supply, things that all of a sudden start coming out that are very, very much common values. And so understanding what those common values are in a scientific way as well as a result of partnerships is something I think we have to give more attention to. The second thing is to staff and organize in a way that is consistent with the values that you say you're interested in. If we were a top-down organization trying to look local, it wouldn't work. We're a local organization that has a regional perspective. Been cut off. So we put 80% of our resources into staffing at the local level. We embed staff for long-term employment, and we tell them two things. One, your job is to engage people and educate, not to be technical experts. You, in fact, have a background in the technical issues, but that's not your job. Your job is to engage people. And we encourage them to be relentlessly incremental and to embrace complexity. So we joke we eat complexity for breakfast. Don't make the world simple, because it's not. And those sort of driving thoughts at the staff level are what produce those large-scale results over time. So those images that you've been looking at, you always go last when you're doing presentations, because then your images end up on the screen. That's the result of a relentlessly incremental approach.
I'd recommend you read Jim Levitt's books. Jim Levitt has written 3 seminal books. One, From Walden to Wall Street, one, Conservation in the Internet Age, and the latest one, Conservation Catalysts. All those books have been, those topics have been raised here in one form or another. He's been an inspiration for me, and also an inspiration to bring us all together at this conference. So I thank Jim for that. Well, Jim's been essentially a coach for me for 7 years. The Conservancy, we got started with the establishment of the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail, which went up every major river in the Chesapeake. And we looked at the Park Service, who manages the trail, and we both realized we were never going to be able to achieve landscape scale results if we didn't partner with everybody. And one of the ways we did that was to leverage technology, to leverage our relationships to achieve collective impact in the watershed. And I'm proud to say that, through the data stuff that I presented and some of the other efforts, we've restored public funding for conservation, attracting $21 million in land and water conservation funds. We restored program Open Space in Maryland, just gave the governor of Maryland an award for it last week at Mount Vernon, which is going to bring an additional $170 million to land conservation. And, we're using our data and our community to prioritize farmland, forest, public access, indigenous cultural landscapes, and wildlife habitat conservation. And right now, at this moment, this is the coolest part. Like 3 or 4 of our partners are up on the Susquehanna River, which provides 50% of the fresh water and about 50% of the pollution to the Chesapeake. And they've used that data to prioritize where they're planting trees, and they're doing a big tree planting with Susquehanna University, Jim, the Conservation Catalysts, and a whole host of government partners. And it's funded by a grocery who's paying for the planting of the trees. So it really is collaborative conservation coming together in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, leveraging the technology. And then lastly, I just want to drive home that we as a community, we have to be on the cutting edge of technology right now. We have to leverage it, just like big banking has and the healthcare industry. If we don't take advantage of what's happening in technology for conservation, we're missing a huge opportunity, whether it's for the historic preservation movement or whether it's for the land conservation or the wildlife movement. We've got to partner with the Microsofts of the world and the Googles of the world, because they're a key component now in saving the planet. And our community has to focus on that and figure out ways we can leverage their influence, their money, and their time to advance our objectives.
So one thing I want to add to this conversation that I think is really important, and that we're finding out at the Trust for Public Land within our 10-Minute Walk campaign, which is an effort to make sure that every household, every person lives within a 10-minute walk of a high-quality park. And this is one of the things that I think is important to collaboration, but especially important when you're working in communities of color and you're working in an urban environment, is that you have to suspend your notions and your assumptions about that community. Even with myself as a person of color, I've been working in sustainability for 10 years. And explaining to my mom what that is and what that means, and clean energy and connecting communities, that's just like difficult for her to wrap her head around. But when I talk to my mom about parks, and parks being a public benefit for health and for economic development, and giving people a better sense of where they are mentally, just going outside their front door and seeing trees, she understands that. And why does she understand that? She understands that because every summer growing up, she took us to Lake Eufaula in Alabama that sits on the Chattahoochee River. You know, she didn't really understand her own personal connection to parks and the outdoors until I started having a conversation to her about, you know, going there every summer, talking to her about those picnics that we have every Labor Day or Memorial Day. And so I think it's really important to suspend those notions that you have about community to move forward. The other thing that I think is really important in the urban context is hire people who live in and work in the community. It's really important to advance this work because a person is going to trust their neighbor and someone who lives in that community more than they're going to trust you and all the data that we have to answer the questions about where parks should be, because they're going to have a better context and better relationship with that person. The other things that I have written down, and thanks to the remarks earlier, I think it's also really important to listen. Sometimes, you know, we as practitioners, we come in the room, we have the answers, we've seen this happen in other places, but sometimes if you just listen to the people who live in that community, they will tell you exactly what they need and what they want and how you can help advance their community. We're learning this at Lakeview Terrace. People have been living there for 20, 30 years. You know, public housing was supposed to be a temporary place, but for them, it's not. It's their community. And all this development is happening around them, you know, $20 million condos and an array of issues. But they are so happy that we are just there listening to them, listening to what they want and what they need, and that, you know, maybe in 2 or 3 years they'll have this park and they don't have to walk 5 to 10 miles up a hill to get to the park in another community that's not theirs and that they didn't participate in creating. And so those are some valuable lessons that I think you will learn, especially as more people are moving to urban centers. Just be conscious of, you know, where you're going and how you're going into this. And I guess the bottom line is to be real and authentic about what you want for that community or what you want to assist that community in reaching their goal.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Yeah, I know it's not the case in this room, but believe it or not, when we go around the country, we run into a lot of people that struggle with some of these interpersonal skills in relationship building, trust building, communication, and it's not something that you can dictate as a supervisor and say go forth and partner and expect results. So I would say either one of two things: either the organizations in this room are going to have to modify the type of people that they actively seek out and hire to find people that like to talk to people and are engaged with people instead of natural resource scientists, or you're going to have to take your natural resource scientists and start providing them with some information on how to do that work, because that, like I said, we see a lot of things that are happening across the country that are really good, even in challenging times, and the difference is the ability of people to form relationships and effective partnerships that sustain them over time. It's not a grant program. It's not a funding stream. It's not a policy. It's the individual relationships that make those things work. So that's something that we work on and would encourage not just external relationship development, but believe it or not, in some places, organizations internally have problems getting along and understanding and partnering with themselves. So I know that may be hard for a lot of folks to believe. Here, we're all landscape level collaborators, and that never happens to any of us, but we do hear about it around the country, believe it or not.
Now I get to go last. No, a lot's been said, and probably what I'm going to say is a restatement, maybe in a more simplistic way, of some of the things that I've already said. When I thought about the question, I went back to, if you don't have anything on the ground, you don't have any working relationships, kind of what are some of the foundational basic items? And it's been said by several folks, but you've got to make it their issue. You can't go in with the answers. You can't go in with all the information, the coolest maps, and everything that drives some of the decision making that we do at our level. But you've got to find, what do they care about, and build from there, even if it's not exactly the issue that you think is the most important thing at that local level. And the second thing, and this may be a restatement, and I know we talked about it at the Tahoe level now, having co-chairs and those things, we often talk about finding the spark plug. I challenge you to find 2 spark plugs that have a differing view of what the answer and solution is, and work those 2 spark plugs together in the groups or the organizations that they represent. Because in the areas that I've seen 2 spark plugs working, it goes farther faster.
Thank you.